Welcome to Global Development Interrupted. I'm Leah Petit. This episode is about erasure and the people who are refusing to let it happen quietly. My guest is Kelli Rogers, a global development journalist who has spent her career telling the stories of real people behind the statistics and making sure they stay visible. When the foreign assistance cuts hit, she was let go from the State Department and went back to journalism to build the aid report at DevEx, a public record of exactly who is being erased and what is being lost in global development. We talk about the real costs of the aid cuts, what it felt like to edit the word equality out of U.S. government documents, why the more we know each other, the better we are, and yes, we even talk about Bad Bunny. So let's get into it and meet Kelli. Kelli, I'm so glad to have you on Global Development Interrupted.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Leah.
I'm excited because we're going to talk about a lot of different things. But before we start, where are you sitting right now?
I am in Illinois, just outside of Champaign-Urbana, where the University of Illinois is.
Excellent. And then my second question is, do you have a fun fact?
Yes, I have a fun fact. So my fun fact is that I have a deep love affair with public transportation. And this applies to public transportation here in the US, when it's available, but also around the world. I'm very dedicated to taking public transport wherever I am. So if I'm in Tanzania, I'm going to be taking the Dala Dala, which is a local bus system, or the bus across Bulgaria. I'm very dedicated to public transportation.
Already we're getting a sense that you have traveled, you're in communications, but where did you grow up? Where do you consider your hometown?
Born in Oregon, but moved very quickly to Ohio for my dad's job when we were young. So I spent my childhood in Ohio and Cincinnati. Roseburg, Oregon is where I was born. But I have family, and my dad grew up in Corvallis, my mom in Portland, and family all throughout Oregon. And so I still feel like I was shaped by those very early days. I just remember being outside a lot. I remember hiking and camping and really clear water, and just kind of a lot of the beauty of Oregon sticks with me from my very early years.
But then you moved to Ohio and you grew up in Ohio?
I did, yeah.
What did held you, though, was nature. Because
Yeah.
You wanted to move into a career around conservation, isn't that right?
Yeah, I think I was always more determined to be a journalist than anything else, but I very much wanted to combine that, and I wanted to be an environmental journalist, hopefully. And so, yeah, always very focused on writing, and that became really clear. I definitely saw myself pursuing some sort of work that aligned with my love for the outdoors and the environment. But I wasn't sure at that time what that would
What
be.
pulled you to writing, to journalism in particular?
I think I loved writing stories as soon as I learned how to write. I have, a collection of these like silly short stories that I started writing at a very young age. And I got much more into creative writing than, journalism or news writing. And then I think that played out even when I went to study journalism. I studied magazine writing. I wanted to, specialize in long form feature writing, narrative writing. That could, house more of a creative flair than news writing. And then, look where I ended up. I ended up in news for a long time.
I mean, isn't it funny?
Yeah.
I said in my Peace Corps interview, they ask you where you want to go and where you wouldn't want to go. And I said, I don't want to go to Africa. And I'm glad that I did go to Africa.
Yeah.
They put me in Cameroon and then I spent 10 years there. So
Wow.
you just never know.
Yeah. You just never know. Your life, it can be shaped by, by your own decisions or by who knows what.
I know. And it's so sad to think that I didn't want to go to Africa. Now knowing
that is shocking because I was desperate to go to Africa.
I know. And now we're going to tell that story because Craigslist ad.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Yeah, I was a very young journalist and, really wanting to gain experience. I had just finished my degree in magazine journalism at University of Missouri, and I answered an ad. And I don't remember where it was. It was basically Craigslist. I don't know what it was. It was some job board, and no one trusted that it was real, but it was a Kenyan man who was interested in starting a magazine and sort of had some of the pieces together and was looking for an editor and clearly looking for a junior type of person. And so I raised my hand and I answered the job ad and was on a plane to Nairobi within, I think, like 2 months. And then I spent a year in Nairobi helping launch that magazine, which was kind of like a social lifestyle type travel magazine. It was really fun to get to write
Yeah.
pieces for it. And I fell deeply, deeply in love with Nairobi and with Kenya.
So you landed in Nairobi, you met the guy and he's like, "Yep, you're going to be an editor." And you did that for a year and a half?
I did it for a year and had planned to stay longer, but for different personal reasons, ended up leaving and moving back to the States.
So how did how did a journalism major who started a society and culture magazine in Nairobi turn to State Department? What was that arc?
I don't know. It's hard to explain, and I don't know how much sense it makes. But so in Nairobi was my first exposure, I would say, to what is called global development, because there were all of these NGOs and UN agencies that had headquarters there, bases there, and just a ton of people doing what I found to be really fascinating and important work, whether that was, through supporting vulnerable children or there was a lot of, wildlife work being done in terms of conservation. In fact, I worked in an office next to Save the Elephants at the time. There was just a lot of exposure to all this incredible work. And I thought, I'm really interested in writing about a lot more about this field, this type of work. So I had moved back to the States. Fast forward, I had a couple of different journalism jobs covering all sorts of things to pay the bills. But I then petitioned DevEx to hire me. And DevEx is a global development news platform based in DC, very niche global development focused platform. And at the time, it was very nascent. They were just building this newsroom and starting this kind of, bid to really cover global development. And, it took a while and I convinced them to hire me. And so I moved to DC and I did that and talk about an education in development, just report on it for years. And so I did that and I am super grateful for that experience. And I had an amazing time, spent a couple of years in Bangkok for DevEx as well. And so I wrote about things like efforts toward gender equality, disaster preparedness. And I was there during the, Rohingya refugee crisis in 2017. And so I covered that. And then I kind of became so you pulled this thread in of my love for the environment earlier. And it kind of raised its head again while I was based in Bangkok. And I was covering at the time a lot of efforts to combine development and conservation. And how do we design these programs that work for people and planet? And this was when I was like, okay, if there's anything I'm going to focus on within development, this is it. This really speaks to me, especially elements of how do we better engage women in these processes and these projects. And so I decided I would get my master's finally, something I had planned to do but never did. And through doing that, I got a Boren Fellowship. As a sort of an element of that fellowship, you're actually required to work for the US government for at least a year. And I ended up interviewed at USAID actually, but I ended up at State.
So you ended up in the State Department working as a communications specialist or?
So in my bid to study international conservation and development, I was fairly committed to making a career pivot and open to working outside of journalism. And so when I took the job at State, it was in part because, the person who hired me, I think, saw that I could apply my journalism skills to anything, which I did. So I took a job as a foreign affairs officer at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. I was hired to focus on Latin America to start with. And I was looking at a lot of research, brief writing, policy creation. This was all very new to me. I'm not a foreign policy wonk. So having covered it from the outside is very different from learning how to create policy on the inside of the US government. So it was super interesting, especially because my bureau the mandate was to deliver on the Global Fragility Act, which is this bipartisan piece of legislation that says that basically the three Ds, defense, development, and diplomacy, can really work far better together to prevent and respond to conflict around the world.
And you were working on how to ensure the 3Ds work well together based on historical knowledge and experience. And then they said, you can leave.
Yes. Yeah. So I had just actually taken over the Columbia portfolio, which I was really excited about. And so I was managing programs during, the time when everything happened, as we say. And so, I remember one of the things I that will stick with me is going through, opening up, the project documents for this project that I was managing and as an editor, I'm very accustomed to, making line edits, right, to things. And so in this instance, it was my job to line out words like LGBTQ plus and equality. And that felt really bad. And that, like, I'll never forget what that felt like. And so yeah, so doing that, knowing things are not going well, and I had never experienced an administration change, right? Like, I was new to the government, and we've been really coached that it's your job to make sure this is a smooth transition. Make sure the transition team has all the information, that they'll ask for a lot of information, make sure they get it. So, we're doing all of this. And yeah, in the meantime, these executive orders are coming out rapid fire. And so I found myself doing work like that. It's lining out.
You were erasing people. They were
Yeah, it was
asking you to erase
they were,
populations of people.
they were asking me to erase populations of people that this particular project had been designed to serve.
And what was the project focused on?
It was focused on peace building and rural peace building in Colombia. So there were a couple that our bureau managed, but this one was trying to strengthen rural peace building councils, local peace councils, and making sure that youth and women were really included in those, and that those peace councils were really plugged into more of the national peace processes.
Why would women be important in peace building?
Well, it's funny you should ask. There actually is a lot of research and literature that says that peace is in fact more durable when women are included early on and often in the peace building process. And so there's a lot of resources and research out there that support that. And not only that, if you ask, right, like local civil society in the country in which you're serving, what they want, the answer is often, they want greater equality and they want representation, especially if they're, rebuilding systems after decades at times of conflict. And so in order to do that in a way that's equitable, everyone has to be represented at the table in which those conversations are taking place. And so there are all sorts of incredible organizations that the US government supported to make sure that women and marginalized communities were kind of plugged into those different tracks of the peace building process, because that isn't necessarily happening without a certain amount of support.
Right. Like everyone needs to be at the table in order for it to be well governed and move
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of like what a democracy is.
Yeah, you might say. You might say, yeah, if you want to just shorten things.
What are some key observations that you have from when you started and then when you left?
When I started, it was an education for me in terms of how does that information reach officials in the US government? And it was really fun to learn how deeply and regularly officials at the State Department read news, like read journalism and journalistic articles, and how deeply interwoven that information is in the decisions that are made. So that was really cool from the perspective of a journalist. But yeah, it felt like there was a lot of opportunity in terms of how do we shape this work. I personally am really interested in environmental peace building, for example, and kind of seeing a more equitable resource conservation and governance as an entryway to build more durable peace. And so it felt like maybe there was a place to start exploring that at state. And I was really interested in being part of that. And then, and then there wasn't. And then there wasn't space for anything. And then we couldn't do our jobs at all. And it was a really severe shift. And something else that will stay with me during that time is just the faces of my colleagues, pretty scarred by, like, I would just look over and look at, a supervisor who I greatly respected, and it just passion, like just crestfallen, coming from a meeting. And I would have yet to learn what the latest was. But it was just a time of extreme turmoil and sadness, and like going into the office and just hugging each other. So that's what I experienced for everything after January was that way.
It's just such a moment of like all of these possibilities and potential to complete devastation.
Yes. Yeah. And what's weird about it is that you feel it on such a personal level of, here I thought I was embarking on this journey, and I thought maybe I could be an interesting voice to have at state. I'm not the kind of person, in my opinion, who ends up working at the State Department. And that was exciting to me. But then there's just this way wider picture of the devastation that has followed for all of the communities that we were serving. And that just feels so much bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. The layers of it. right?
Yeah,
The personal devastation, your community that's surrounding you, and then the impact out.
exactly.
So that brings us to what you worked on with DevEx when you returned, like when we talk about how that was impacting communities around the world. So you came back and you thought, okay, journalism it is.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a really tough job market, and I feel like I still don't totally know what's next for me, but I deeply love journalism and I believe in it, especially now, considering the information environment that we're in, and kind of all of the attacks on information and trust in information here in the US, but around the world. And so, yeah, I came on board with DevEx, and with a media grant from the Gates Foundation to build something that we call the aid report, which is basically aiming to be a hub of evidence for real world impacts of the US foreign assistance cuts across the world. So across geographies and across sectors. So pretty ambitious project. Yeah.
So how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, it was actually very useful to have gone to school for social science as well, I think, and to have that research background along with my journalism background because this project really does both. So I'm commissioning original reported stories that are digging into what we think are the more lesser understood impacts. So maybe those, especially outside of health, which have been really well covered for excellent reasons because they're so immediate and often horrific. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is I started immediately reaching out to big NGOs, so NGOs who had received US funding to implement programs on the ground or to partner with local organizations to figure out what they knew. Because a lot of what they knew was just kind of living on internal drives in their computers or maybe used for advocacy here and there. But in fact, making it public and adding it to this evidence base and in a more holistic way, we thought would be a public good. And so I was just on the phone for those first weeks, nonstop, just being like, hey, we're starting this new project. Would you be willing to share the data that you have collected or the understanding that you do have in terms of the impacts on the people that you served? And so, many organizations were willing to do that. And that's how we started the database and really how we continue to grow it.
And it's also in reaction to the fact that a lot of the information that the US government had on development was being erased.
Yes. And that's still, I think, to an extent, my biggest concern. We just put out a report on some of the cross-cutting trends that we're seeing just from the data that we've collected, some of which is aggregated, some of which is original to the aid report. And yeah, it's hugely concerning the number of monitoring systems and data collection efforts that are offline and things that you don't think about. So, the data collection that would tell a country where people are hungriest so that the World Food Program could deliver food to the right populations in Ethiopia, for example. Well, if that data collection isn't happening, it's also not going into the bigger kind of more global data sets that warn of famine and things like that. So it's these knock-on impacts are scary, I think, when we talk about information and data, especially.
Yeah. Getting back to that point that you made earlier about needing to know, even if you have funding and you have resources and people, knowing where to go to be the most impactful is incredibly important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think increasingly organizations are, I mean, when I have these one-on-one conversations, for example, we just had a conversation with someone in Latin America who had been working for USAID as a national of that country and was the one who was really connected with all the civil society groups, right? So had hundreds of contacts and knew where everyone was working and what they were working on, which is essential information for the US government, really, to do its job well, too. And she described how devastating the abrupt cuts were to those relationships and is now in touch with a very small fraction of those people, which you think like maybe you think, okay, no big deal. But this was also an information network. Like oftentimes this is how the US government knew what's going on in this rural area of this country. We don't know anymore. And these kind of like data blackouts, I think, are really common now, even with NGOs that used to be super plugged in to those communities or maybe that specific area that will tell you we don't know what's happening there anymore.
There's also a security and a policy and a strategy point as well. where if you don't understand the whole landscape of a country through these different civil society organizations, community engagement, you have a harder time making strategic policies or decisions in that country to enhance security, prosperity, like a numerous amount of things for Americans and our position in that country.
Yes, absolutely. And I think so through some of the reporting that I'm assigning, we're trying to get at some of that. I was working with a reporter who was covering a story in Nepal, and there was a huge nutrition program and an education program that were canceled there. And the impact that that is having on young women whose only opportunity for education in this case was this program. And the implications that that has then for her future, her health, any opportunities outside of early marriage, for example. And trying to figure out, like, I don't think it should be my job to, make this like direct line to why that maybe makes economic sense for the American people. Like, some of this I feel like was moral leadership. It was things that we decided as, the royal we, the United States, decided that we believed in democratic principles, we believed in women's education, we believed in equality, and that for everyone should have the access to improve their lives. And so, yeah, without that, I think that's why a lot of us feel at sea right now.
So, what is one story that stands out to you from the aid report?
I think so far, we were working with a reporter in Nepal on a story on the end of this education program. And she did an incredible job of going out to a community that faces really high rates of child marriage and interviewing one girl who was in classes as a result of this US funded education program that sort of designed things specifically in a way that would allow parents who perhaps for a different cultural and religious reasons didn't believe that their children should attend school. But through this program, because of the way it was carefully designed, they were allowed to. And it was changing things. And this one girl, her name was Apsana Khatun, she was in school and really looking forward to her future. Tells, her experience of losing that opportunity. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And I think it helps us it's, storytelling. It helps us see beyond these numbers that are also really important and part of the project of saying this many thousands of girls lost out on education. Maybe that doesn't really speak to you as much as this story of what it felt like to this girl. And so I think that's what's been important in terms of making sure that we're reporting this from a human-centered perspective, and putting voices to what can feel like just an abstract number.
Yeah. It just made me realize that when I was in fourth or fifth grade, I saw a picture in National Geographic of this little girl in this terrible wedding dress in a slum, and she's begging people to marry her so she didn't have to go into sexual slavery. And that has stayed with me my whole life. And it's just, yeah, these stories matter because it impacts the decisions that you make later in life.
It does. Yeah, there's another example of a program called Dreams, which I know you're aware of
Yes,
because
very much.
yeah. And so I have a reporter right now who's working on a story about some of the girls who were participating in Dreams in Kenya and the just direct devastation that has been felt as a result of the loss of that program and the opportunities that it afforded young women to pursue their education and to have, options that existed beyond hoping that a man will pay for your sanitary towel or your school fees, which is the situation that many girls find themselves in today. But Dreams is an initiative. It's a public-private partnership. It's under the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. It started in 2014, and the idea was that, young women and girls are at really high risk of contracting HIV, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So how do we address that? One of the ways is to take this really youth-centered approach to the work and girl-centered approach and making safe spaces for girls to come together and learn about their health, their well-being, how to avoid gender-based violence, how to continue their education, just creating spaces for dialogue and also getting access to antiretroviral treatment or other medicines that they need to prevent HIV infection or to treat HIV should they already have it.
Essentially creating community and opportunity for women who don't have a lot of it open to them.
Exactly. One of the ways that these abrupt aid cuts have punished global development maybe the most, or specifically USAID, was because of how integrated the programs were. Because that's the way that the industry was going, because that's what worked and that's what made the most sense. But then cutting these programs, for example, a school feeding program was not only affecting, the children and the families who were benefiting from it and getting that regular meal in school and keeping them in school, but then also the smallholder farmers who were providing those foodstuffs to the school also lost out on their economic opportunity and like the knock-on impacts in the community of that. That's just one tiny example, but
Well, wait, boy,
there's
we can even build on that more because if you're not fed, you don't want to take your HIV medication and therefore you get off of it. And then HIV comes resistance to that particular medication. And
yes,
we build
yeah,
out into how does that affect the rest of the world if we
yes.
continue to see resistance? Yes, it's all interconnected, but it's very hard to put on a bumper sticker.
It is.
So, but with the aid report, are there things that you're seeing that make you hopeful?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Because one of the things that I am clinging to right now is that the aid report is just one of this constellation of efforts to protect knowledge, to download information, to make sense of it. There are all sorts of organizations and even small groups of researchers who are dedicating themselves to making sure that yes, this happened, but at least we have to know what happened so we can learn from it. And it feels good to know that we are this community of dedicated folks who are just like doggedly moving forward as best they can in pursuit of protecting this information and the civic maintenance element of it, like creating this shared evidence base that is true, that is trustworthy in a landscape where it feels really hard to trust information. Um, yeah, anyway. So that makes me feel good to know that so many people out there who also feel compelled to keep this up.
Are there any other spaces where you are inspired by what people are doing or that gives you hope for the future?
I mean, I think, okay, this is going to sound silly, but it just happened and we just watched it. The Super Bowl performance gave me hope.
Mhm.
It just felt like a cultural celebration. And it's like you don't realize how much you miss things until they're gone. I mean, you do, but it just felt good and celebratory and inclusive. And it made me think about art as a political statement and the way that we turn to performance art or poetry or, certain musicians during times of despair. And so, yeah, I think I'm grateful for the people who are continuing to create art and speak out about creating the US that they want to see. And that's happening all over the place. And that's not just in the global development sector. Yeah, I'm thankful for that. So there are moments of hope, but it's also, I will say, it's been difficult to parse through the fallout from this.
As Bad Bunny says,
Yes.
love is more powerful than hate. And to lean into that joy because people want to be part of that more than they want to be angry.
Yes. Yeah. Joy as resistance, which I think that it also brought forward. Do these conversations that you have give you hope?
But it's been an interesting journey in terms of how different guests have talked about what hope is, right? We have hope is the hard choice, forced hope, and hope for better.
Hmm.
But hope has always been central to many of the conversations that I've had. But storytelling, as you said, is super important to the whole point because you can be mad at an idea, but it's harder to dehumanize someone once you know who they are and why they acted the way they did.
This is very true.
So, if you had sort of one key message to the American public as to why global development matters to them, what would that be? I mean, we've talked a lot about it, different things, but if you had to distill it down into a bumper sticker.
Into a bumper sticker, how dare you? After we just said that's impossible.
I know, but I was like, she's up for the challenge. No, you don't have to make it a bumper sticker.
I briefly worked at the University of Montana in international exchange, and it was a US government funded international exchange where we brought 18 scholars from 18 different countries to the University of Montana for 6 weeks during the summer. And it was incredible. So I had spent all of this time on exchanges or outside of the United States, learning about other cultures. I had never been on the receiving end as an American showing off my town and, my country, my people. And it was so, um, I was so grateful for the experience because I learned so much about what it is to be an American through the eyes of these participants. And so we got to do things like go to different 4th of July celebrations. And we lived in a place where there was a large Native American population. So we were able to see different ways that it was celebrated, have conversations about the history of the US, in sort of a negative and positive way. And it was, I felt transformative for me because I would sort of get called out sometimes as, wow, Kelli, you sounded so American right then. And in one of those cases, it was a Romanian participant who I valued so much. I loved him. And we were talking about politics. And I was saying at the time that I had concerns about where things were headed in the US. And I wanted to make sure that I wasn't sure my voice was being heard. I wasn't sure how to make my voice heard at the time. And he told me, "You sound so American. You have no idea." And I thought about it, and I think maybe some people would have been offended or felt the need to defend, but I just thought, it's true. It's true. I'm an American, and I've lived in an American democracy my entire life, and I've enjoyed the privilege of that. And so I think for me, the value of knowing one another in these ways, whether it's inviting people here to the US, whether it's heading out and living in Bangkok for years or for living in Kenya, I just think that the more that we know each other, the better we are as people and a world. And global development was, some would say the most effective vehicle to make sure that happened. And so yeah, I think that's the thought about global development that I think I would leave on.
Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it as well. It was really fun.
This is Leah. If you liked this episode, follow Global Development Interrupted wherever you get your podcasts. And subscribe on Substack to get news stories and updates straight to your inbox. When you subscribe, you'll also get GDI Insights, short written reflections from people who built their careers in global development and public health. They reflect on the work, the disruption, and what they're carrying forward, what they want to see next. And remember to always like and follow. Until next time.